During World War II, while Allied forces were fighting their way across Europe, a secret unit of just over 1,000 men was conducting an entirely different kind of warfare. These weren't your typical soldiers. They were artists, designers, sound engineers, and actors. Their mission: to deceive the German army using nothing but illusions. This is the incredible true story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, better known as the Ghost Army, a unit so classified that their extraordinary contributions to winning the war remained secret for nearly 50 years after the conflict ended. Between 1944 and 1945, this remarkable unit conducted more than 20 battlefield deceptions across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. They saved countless lives by making the enemy believe entire divisions were positioned where they weren't, allowing real Allied forces to strike where the Germans least expected. And the truly remarkable part? They did it all with rubber tanks, wooden artillery, fake radio transmissions, and Hollywood-style special effects. By this point in the war, the Allies were preparing for the massive D-Day invasion of Normandy. Military planners understood that conventional warfare alone wouldn't be enough. They needed every advantage they could get. The concept of military deception wasn't new. Throughout history, generals had used various tricks to confuse their enemies. But the Ghost Army would take this to an unprecedented level, combining multiple deception techniques into a coordinated art form. The unit was officially activated in January 1944 at Camp Forest, Tennessee. The Army began recruiting men with very specific skills that had nothing to do with traditional combat. They sought out artists from prestigious art schools, audio engineers from radio stations, actors from theater companies, and designers from advertising agencies. Among their ranks were some truly talented individuals. Fashion designer Bill Blass served in the Ghost Army. So did painter Ellsworth Kelly, who would later become one of America's most celebrated artists. These weren't men who had planned to spend the war painting fake insignias on trucks or inflating rubber tanks, but their unique skills would prove invaluable. The recruitment process was deliberately vague. Many volunteers had no idea what they were signing up for. They were simply told they'd be doing special work that required creativity and artistic ability. It wasn't until they arrived at training that they discovered they'd be learning the art of military deception. The Ghost Army was divided into 4 main units, each with specialized deception capabilities. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers handled visual deception, creating fake equipment and installations. The 3132nd Signal Service Company Special managed sonic deception, broadcasting recorded sounds of troops and vehicles. The Signal Company Special created spoof radio traffic to fool German intelligence operators. And the 406th Combat Engineers provided security and support for operations. Now let's talk about the incredible tools these men used to fool the German army. And I mean this literally when I say the equipment was incredible, because much of it seemed too absurd to actually work. First, we have the inflatable tanks. Yes, you heard that right. Inflatable tanks. These weren't cheap party balloons. They were sophisticated rubber replicas of M4 Sherman tanks, weighing just 85 pounds but looking absolutely convincing from a distance or from aerial reconnaissance. A small team of just 4 men could inflate one of these dummy tanks in about 15 minutes using air compressors. Once inflated, they looked remarkably realistic, complete with painted details, fake tracks, and even simulated guns. The Ghost Army carried inflatable versions of multiple vehicle types: tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and even aircraft. They had over 1,000 pieces of this dummy equipment at their disposal. When deployed across a field, these inflatable decoys could make it appear that an entire armored division had taken up position. But visual deception was just one element. The Germans weren't stupid. They would notice if what looked like a massive military buildup was completely silent. This is where sonic deception came in. The 3132nd Signal Service Company had access to cutting-edge audio technology. They recorded the sounds of actual military operations: tanks moving, troops marching, equipment being assembled, trucks convoy rumbling down roads. These recordings were then played back through massive speakers mounted on half-tracks. Each speaker weighed 500 pounds and could project sound up to 15 miles away. Imagine being a German scout in the darkness, hearing what sounds like an entire armored division preparing for an attack several miles away. You report this intelligence back to command, and they begin repositioning their forces to counter this threat. Meanwhile, the real Allied attack is coming from a completely different direction. The Ghost Army also employed what they called special effects. They'd light campfires to simulate troop encampments. They'd hang laundry on lines. They'd create tank tracks in the mud by dragging logs behind vehicles. Every detail mattered because German reconnaissance was sophisticated, and the deception needed to hold up under scrutiny. Radio deception added another crucial layer. The signal company special would mimic the radio traffic patterns of actual combat units. They studied how real divisions communicated and replicated those patterns precisely. German intelligence operators listening to Allied radio frequencies would intercept communications that seemed to indicate specific units were in specific locations, when in reality, those units might be hundreds of miles away. Before the Ghost Army even deployed to Europe, Allied deception planners had already executed one of the war's most successful operations, Operation Fortitude. While the Ghost Army itself wasn't directly involved in Fortitude, this operation set the stage for understanding just how effective large-scale military deception could be. Operation Fortitude was designed to convince the Germans that the D-Day invasion would happen at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The Allies created an entire phantom army called the 1st United States Army Group, supposedly commanded by General George Patton, who the Germans believed was America's best general. This fake army group used dummy equipment, fake radio traffic, and planted intelligence to convince German command that over 1 million men were preparing to invade at Calais. The deception worked spectacularly. Even after the real invasion began at Normandy on June 6, 1944, Hitler remained convinced that the Normandy landings were a diversion and that the main invasion would still come at Calais. He held back crucial armored divisions from the Normandy battle, divisions that might have pushed the Allies back into the sea. This success proved that deception could work on a strategic level. Now it was time for the Ghost Army to prove it could work at the tactical level, on actual battlefields across Europe. The Ghost Army landed in France shortly after D-Day and immediately went to work. Their first major operation took place in mid-June 1944 near the town of St. Lo. Here's how a typical Ghost Army operation worked. Real Allied units would quietly withdraw from a position under cover of darkness. Simultaneously, the Ghost Army would move in and begin setting up their elaborate deception. By dawn, inflatable tanks would be positioned where real armor had been. Sonic equipment would broadcast the sounds of military activity. Radio operators would begin transmitting in the codes and patterns of the units they were impersonating. Meanwhile, soldiers from the Ghost Army would adopt the shoulder patches and insignia of the units they were pretending to be. They'd visit nearby towns, making sure to be seen wearing these markings. They'd strike up conversations in cafes and bars, carefully dropping information about their unit that would likely reach German intelligence through French informants or resistance networks. This was dangerous work. The Ghost Army operated close to enemy lines, often within artillery range. If the Germans realized what was happening, that they were facing not real combat units but a handful of men with rubber props, the Ghost Army would be extremely vulnerable. They had minimal defensive capabilities and relied on maintaining their illusion and the protection of genuine combat units nearby. One of their most successful early operations took place during the Allied breakout from Normandy. The Ghost Army impersonated the 2nd Armored Division, creating the illusion that this powerful unit remained in position on the left flank while the real 2nd Armored secretly repositioned for a major offensive. The deception tied down German forces, preventing them from reinforcing against the actual attack. The operation near Brest, France demonstrated the Ghost Army's ability to coordinate complex, multi-layered deceptions. In September 1944, while American forces assaulted the heavily defended port city of Brest, the Ghost Army created the illusion of a major buildup south of the city. They deployed over 200 inflatable vehicles, broadcast sonic programs, and generated extensive radio traffic. German commanders, believing they faced a two-pronged attack, divided their defensive forces. The deception contributed to the capture of the port. But perhaps their most crucial operation came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. When German forces launched their massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes, Allied lines were stretched thin and in danger of collapse. The Ghost Army conducted multiple rapid deployment deceptions, creating the illusion of reinforcements arriving much faster than was actually possible. In one operation, they impersonated the entire 75th Infantry Division, making the Germans believe that American strength in a critical sector was far greater than it actually was. What's truly fascinating about the Ghost Army is how they transformed warfare into performance art. These men weren't just following technical manuals. They were using genuine creativity and artistic intuition to sell their illusions. The artists in the unit were constantly sketching and painting. But their art served a military purpose. They'd paint camouflage patterns on equipment, create realistic weathering effects on dummy vehicles, and design fake unit patches and insignia. Their artistic eyes helped them understand how the Germans would perceive their deceptions from various distances and angles. When setting up a fake encampment, Ghost Army soldiers thought like stage designers. They'd consider sightlines, lighting conditions, and how their set would appear to aerial reconnaissance. They understood that small details sold the illusion. A few soldiers playing baseball near dummy tanks made the scene look authentic. Wet laundry drying on lines suggested troops had been there long enough to do their washing. The sound engineers approached their work with equal creativity. They'd mix different audio elements like a composer arranging a symphony. The sound of tanks needed to be mixed with the sound of troops, supply trucks, and occasional shouted orders to create a convincing audio landscape. They'd vary the volume and timing to suggest realistic military activity rather than a simple recording on loop. During downtime between operations, many Ghost Army soldiers continued creating art for its own sake. They sketched the French countryside, painted portraits of their fellow soldiers, and documented their experiences through their art. After the war, several Ghost Army veterans became successful professional artists, and their wartime artwork provides a unique perspective on World War II. This creative approach extended to problem solving. When equipment failed or conditions changed unexpectedly, Ghost Army soldiers improvised. If inflatable tanks were damaged, they'd repair them with whatever materials were at hand. If weather conditions made sonic deception ineffective, they'd adapt by emphasizing visual or radio deception instead. Make no mistake, serving in the Ghost Army was genuinely dangerous. These men operated close to enemy lines with minimal defensive weaponry. Their survival depended on the Germans believing they were facing real combat units rather than a deception team. There were several close calls throughout their service. On multiple occasions, German patrols approached Ghost Army positions. The deception soldiers had to quickly hide their dummy equipment and rely on support units to drive off the enemy before their secret was discovered. During one operation near Luxembourg, German artillery began shelling Ghost Army positions. The soldiers had to endure the bombardment while maintaining their deception, moving inflatable tanks around to simulate a real unit reacting to artillery fire. Several men were wounded, and all were terrified, but they held their positions. The psychological stress was significant. These soldiers faced the constant fear that their deception might be discovered. They knew that if the Germans realized they were facing decoys rather than real forces, they might launch an attack that the lightly armed Ghost Army could never repel. Some operations required Ghost Army soldiers to move through areas still containing German troops. They'd paint their vehicles with the markings of forward combat units and drive straight down roads where they might encounter enemy patrols, hoping their false insignia would make German scouts report seeing units that weren't actually there. Despite these dangers, the Ghost Army suffered relatively few casualties compared to conventional combat units. Out of approximately 1,100 men who served in the unit, fewer than 10 were killed in action. This was partly due to luck, partly due to the protection provided by nearby combat units, and partly because their deceptions kept them from becoming direct targets. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the Ghost Army had conducted over 20 major tactical deceptions. They'd operated in 5 European countries and participated in campaigns from Normandy to the Rhine. Their illusions had diverted enemy forces, protected real Allied units, and saved countless lives. After VE Day, the unit was deactivated. The soldiers returned home, but unlike other veterans, they couldn't talk about what they'd done. The entire Ghost Army operation was classified top secret. The military believed these deception techniques might be valuable in future conflicts and didn't want potential enemies knowing how they worked. So these men came home with incredible stories they couldn't tell. For decades, Ghost Army veterans maintained their silence about one of the most unusual military units in history. When asked what they did in the war, they'd give vague answers about special engineering work, or would simply remain quiet. Imagine being part of such an extraordinary operation and not being able to share it with anyone. Not your spouse, not your children, not your friends. Many Ghost Army veterans felt frustrated that their service remained unknown while other units received recognition and glory. It wasn't until 1996, more than 50 years after the war ended, that the Ghost Army's operations were finally declassified. Veterans could finally tell their stories. Books were written, documentaries were produced, and the public learned about this remarkable unit for the first time. The revelation fascinated historians and the public alike. Here was an entire dimension of World War II that had remained completely hidden. The story of artists and creative professionals using their skills to deceive the enemy seemed almost too remarkable to be true, yet all of it was documented and verified. In 2013, the Ghost Army story reached an even wider audience with the PBS documentary, The Ghost Army, which featured interviews with surviving veterans and showcased their wartime artwork. The documentary helped ensure that these men finally received recognition for their unique contribution to winning the war. The Ghost Army's legacy extends far beyond their World War II service. They demonstrated that creativity and artistic thinking have a place in military operations. Their success proved that deception, when executed skillfully, could be as effective as firepower. Modern militaries studied the Ghost Army's techniques extensively. While inflatable tanks might seem quaint in an age of satellite reconnaissance and thermal imaging, the principles underlying Ghost Army operations remain relevant. Military deception is now a recognized discipline taught at war colleges around the world. The Ghost Army also influenced how militaries think about personnel. The idea that artists, designers, and creative professionals could make crucial military contributions became accepted. Today's military information operations, psychological warfare units, and cyber operations all trace intellectual lineage back to units like the Ghost Army. Several Ghost Army veterans went on to distinguished careers in the arts. Fashion designer Bill Blass built an empire in American fashion after the war. Painter Ellsworth Kelly became one of the most important American artists of the 20th century. Art Schultz became a successful painter and sculptor. These men took the skills they'd honed deceiving the Germans and applied them to creating beauty in peacetime. The Ghost Army has also become a symbol of the unconventional thinking that helped the Allies win World War II. Alongside codebreakers at Bletchley Park and the scientists of the Manhattan Project, the Ghost Army represents how diverse skills and innovative approaches contributed to victory. In 2019, legislation was introduced in the U.S. Congress to award the Congressional Gold Medal to the Ghost Army, one of the highest civilian honors. The effort reflected a desire to formally recognize these veterans' contributions before the last of them passed away. As of recent years, only a handful of Ghost Army veterans remain alive, all now in their late 90s or older. The story of the Ghost Army reminds us that war is not just about firepower and courage, though both are essential. It's also about intelligence, creativity, and the willingness to think differently about solving problems. These 1,000 men with their inflatable tanks and sound effects machines probably saved thousands of lives. Every time they successfully deceived German commanders, they protected real Allied soldiers from enemy fire. Every time their deceptions caused the Germans to position troops in the wrong place, They gave Allied forces an advantage that translated directly into lives saved and objectives achieved. But perhaps the most inspiring aspect of the Ghost Army story is what it says about human creativity. These artists and designers could have spent the war painting propaganda posters or designing recruiting materials. Instead, they were given the opportunity to apply their creative skills directly to battlefield operations, and they proved brilliantly effective. The Ghost Army showed that there's no single way to serve, no single skill set that makes someone valuable in times of crisis. The fashion designer, the sound engineer, the painter, and the stage designer all found ways to contribute meaningfully to their nation's war effort, and their contributions were every bit as important as those of the infantry soldier or tank commander. Today, when you see those incredible inflatable tanks in museums or in photographs from Ghost Army exhibitions, remember that these absurd-looking rubber props were instruments of sophisticated military deception. Behind each one was a team of creative professionals who understood that in warfare, as in art, perception is reality. The Germans saw entire divisions where none existed. They heard armies that were never there. They reacted to threats that were nothing but air and canvas and sound recordings. And while they focused on these ghosts, real Allied forces struck where it mattered most. That's the legacy of the Ghost Army. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the one that makes the loudest noise, but the one your enemy never sees coming. If you enjoyed learning about this incredible chapter of World War II history, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more fascinating historical content. Let me know in the comments what aspect of the Ghost Army story you found most interesting. And if you know a Ghost Army veteran or are related to one, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.